A reading from 1 John. See what love the Father has given us, that we should be called children of God, and that is what we are. The reason the world does not know us is that it did not know him. Beloved, we are God's children now. What we will be has not yet been revealed. What we do know is this: when he is revealed, we will be like him, for we will see him as he is. And all who have this hope in him purify themselves, just as he is pure. Everyone who commits sin is guilty of lawlessness. Sin is lawlessness. You know that he was revealed to take away sins, and in him there is no sin. No one who abides in him sins. No one who sins has either seen him or known him. Little children, let no one deceive you. Everyone who does what is right is righteous, just as he is righteous. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Well, aside from the good book itself, possibly the most popular piece of devotional material in all of Christian history is an infinitely smaller, tiny little volume called The Imitation of Christ. It was written in the early 1400s by a Dutch monk, not by a duck, a Dutch monk. It would be much more popular if it had been written by a duck. A Dutch monk named Thomas. And the book begins like this: He that followeth me walketh not in darkness, saith the Lord. These are the words of Christ, by which we are taught how we ought to imitate his life and manners, if we would truly be enlightened and delivered from all blindness of heart. For Thomas, disillusioned by the material excess and superstitions of the medieval church, the key to this whole Christianity business was actually very basic. Being a faithful Christian simply meant imitating as closely and as carefully as possible the life of Jesus Christ. And I read a passage like 1 John 3, and I'm right there with Thomas. Just listen again to the third verse. All who have this hope in him purify themselves just as he is pure. And then later on in verse 7, everyone who does what is right is righteous just as he is righteous. It's pretty clear that 1 John believes that this beloved community, the church, is made up of those who spend their lives carefully and closely imitating Jesus. It is, after all, the sincerest form of flattery. And there's some powerful truth in this idea of imitation. Elsewhere in the New Testament, Paul explicitly commands the church at Corinth to be imitators of him, even as he is an imitator of Jesus. We should be imitators of Christ. There is something good and right in that notion. But at the same time, I also worry that in the modern world especially, the idea of imitation doesn't go nearly far enough. Almost 15 years ago, a landmark project called the National Study of Youth and Religion was published by sociologists Christian Smith and Melinda Denton. And one of the most interesting things that the two found in their study was that the vast majority of American teenagers, regardless of their own professed religion, practiced a form of spirituality that Smith and Denton came to call moralistic therapeutic deism. It's a mouthful, I know. But what it means is that most American teenagers who believe anything believe in a kind of spirituality wherein God only really exists to make you happy, and the only thing that God asks for in return is that you be a good person, whatever that means. I suppose being a good person is not an entirely bad form of spirituality, But it's not an entirely good form of spirituality either, because, especially in North America, moralistic, therapeutic deism has reduced much of the drama of the Christian story to simply imitating Jesus, and thereby much of the Christian life has been reduced to a simple and strict moral code. For most of American Christians, imitating Jesus looks an awful lot like don't drink, don't smoke, don't steal, don't have premarital sex, don't dance, don't have fun. And most of these are not inherently bad moral guidelines. In fact, I quite agree with the one about not dancing. Just for me, not for y'all. It's a personal thing. But when we begin to reduce the cosmic drama of the Christian life to a string of prohibitions with the odd platitude tacked on about happiness, what are we really offering people? Is it anything more than they can get from a movie on the Hallmark Channel? St. Augustine, who was a 4th century bishop of the church in North Africa, knew the problem with this simple kind of imitation when he wrote these words. For those who are called children and are not children, what profit them the name where the thing is not? How many are called physicians, but do not know how to heal? How many are called watchers, but sleep all the night long? So many are called Christians, yet in their deeds are not found to be, because they are not actually what they are called. That is, in life, in hope, and in charity. Imitation can be a good beginning. For many of us, it is the entryway into Christianity, but it is not the sum total of this Christian life. Imitation has the power to make us appear to be like Christ without the transformation required to actually be like Christ. Which is why, though there certainly is an element of imitation in this reading from 1 John, the primary metaphor of our passage today is the metaphor of adoption. Hear again these words from verse 1. See what love the Father has given us, that we should be called children of God. Now, adoption in the ancient world was a little bit different than it is in our own modern context. For us, adoption is primarily about the building of a family unit, and the raising of children. And there was an element of that in the ancient world, but for the people who lived at the time that 1 John was written, adoption was primarily about the continuation of a family legacy. Often, the people who were adopted were men and women in their 30s and 40s who were being grafted into a family to try and continue what that family was about. Being adopted constituted a kind of personal and social transformation, so much so that those who were adopted would often literally change their names to the names of not just the family, but the person who was adopting them, and it became for them the kind of first step towards continuing that family legacy into the future. Perhaps the most famous story of adoption in the ancient world is the story of a young man named Gaius Octavius Thurinus, who was born into an old but declining family in the year 63 BC. It was clear to everyone that this boy was incredibly bright, but given his family's destiny, he seemed like he was going to end up in a rather unremarkable career in Roman middle management. But Gaius Octavius' path was forever altered in the year 51, when, at the tender age of 12, he was called upon to give a eulogy at the funeral of his grandmother. And so great was this boy's talent for public speaking and persuasion that from that moment on, Gaius Octavius began attracting the attention of a number of rather important Roman citizens, chief among them his great uncle, his grandmother's brother, you may have heard of. His name was Julius Caesar. 7 years after the funeral, Julius Caesar was assassinated. And when they finally tracked down his will and read it in public, which is what they did back then, Everybody was incredibly surprised because Caesar had made a provision in his will that young Gaius Octavius would become his legal heir and the continuation of his legacy. So, at the age of 19, Gaius Octavius Thurinus was renamed Gaius Julius Caesar, and he made it his mission to control the Roman world the way that his adopted father, had begun to. Less than a year later, he was elected the Roman equivalent of a president, and he spent the next 16 years consolidating his power and ruling the largest empire in the world at that point in time, eventually earning the name most of us know him by, the name which is referenced at least once in the Bible, Caesar Augustus. This young man was transformed indeed. Now, the story of Caesar Augustus is obviously far from typical, and I don't mean to suggest this morning that the Roman emperor would have been a model of moral behavior emulated by the earliest Christian communities, but I cannot doubt that this idea of Roman adoption, of continuing the legacy of being transformed, were in the mind of the author of 1 John. Because when God graciously adopts us into the divine household, God does not simply ask us to behave better. God begins the process of transforming us into the likeness of Jesus Christ. You'll notice something interesting about this 1 John passage if you pay close attention. There are no imperatives in this passage. There are no commandments. You see, often when we talk about being conformed to the image of Christ, the burden is on us, on our own human activity to be better, to be kinder, to be more just, to love more fully, whatever the person in the pulpit happens to want people to do that week. And again, these are worthy goals. I would want everybody in this room to be kinder and to do justice and to love more fully. But these activities are never the first step. They are only our response in imitation of Jesus because God has first graciously adopted us into God's own family. We are only able to begin imagining to do and be better because God has already taken the gracious initiative on our behalf. The modern American monk and mystic Thomas Merton, who you've already heard a few times this morning, says it this way: "My union with Christ is much more than an imitation of his virtues as they are described in the gospel. It must be a union created in me by the transforming action of his own Spirit." Like Caesar Augustus, we find ourselves transformed, graciously marked not only by Christ's death on our behalf, but also by his life, by his very name. We are Christians after all. And like Caesar Augustus, through this transformation, we find ourselves newly and powerfully committed to the family legacy. It's not just that we begin to lead a good life, it's that we lead a transformed life, one shaped by the cruciform way of Jesus. It's not enough for us to be better people, but rather to be little Christs, to be marked not just by basic morality, but by his whole way of being, by self-giving love, compassionate presence, and a willingness to confront injustice. The beloved community that John imagines, the beloved community to which we all belong, is not a community of people merely trying to do good. It's a community of people forever changed by the way of Jesus. Now, the tricky part is that this beloved community is not yet the fullest expression of what it shall be. 1 John says, "We are God's children now. What we will be has not yet been revealed. And though we have already been adopted into the family of God and are continually transformed into the image of Christ, there is a future element to all of this beloved community. We do not know exactly what it will look like, but we do know that what will come will be rooted in our experience of the risen Christ here and now. We who are God's children will be like him in the future. The two experiences go hand in hand. We who are already being transformed into the image of Christ will one day be perfectly transformed into that image in the age to come. Which is also, by the way, why 1 John can say this very strange line, "No one who abides in him sins." I can't begin to express to you how much ink has been spilled trying to interpret this one brief verse, but you can probably intuit it because you all know that even though 1 John says this, there are plenty of Christians, none of them in this room, who still sin. You don't have to be a theologian to know that this is true. Just turn on the evening news. This question of being able or unable to sin is a particularly live one for me. Some of you know that I was raised in the Wesleyan Church, which is a kind of holiness-flavored branch of Methodism. And in the Wesleyan tradition, there is this doctrine called entire sanctification, which begins to describe this belief that the Wesleyans have that one can attain a state of sinless perfection prior to one's own death and intimate union with Jesus in the age to come. Now, in theory, entire sanctification is a gift of God and an act of great grace. But in practice, it often gets talked about as an issue of willpower. And the question I found myself asking over and over and over again as a teenager was, why don't I seem to have enough willpower of my own to keep me away from sin? And specifically to keep me away from what my church considered sin, which included dancing and all of that. And of course, if you've ever been a teenager, you know that the answer to that question is there never is enough willpower. But thanks be to God, beloved, that none of this is actually about human willpower. None of this is about our human ability to more closely imitate Jesus. It's not about being a better Christian or even being a better person. It's about recognizing the gracious activity of God in conforming us to the image of Jesus Christ. So when 1 John talks about not sinning, he's not making this absurd claim that Christians magically don't want to or are unable of committing sin. He's claiming that the image towards which we are always continually being formed is an image of sinlessness and holiness, the very image of Jesus Christ. In her autobiography, the great American writer Gertrude Stein tells this interesting story about an encounter that she had with the Spanish painter Pablo Picasso. Stein, as you know, was famous for gathering American and European intellectuals in her living room in Paris. And one night, while they were sitting around after dinner, a friend of Stein's looked at Picasso and she told him how much she enjoyed this portrait of Gertrude Stein that Picasso had just finished painting. And Picasso kind of leaned back in his chair and he sighed a little bit and he said, "Yeah, somebody said that she does not look like it. But that doesn't make any difference. She will." Beloved, we might not look like Jesus now, at least not entirely. But we cannot let shame overtake us. We cannot be consumed in desiring more willpower. Looking like Jesus isn't something we can make happen through sheer force of will. The image of Jesus is one into which we are all growing thanks to the gracious activity of God the Father. One day after supper, somebody may say to one of us, "You don't look much like Jesus," but we will. Amen.